We are in the prime of picking bedding plants, buying them, and planting them. So I get a lot of questions about what is a good bedding plant to pick or what should I be looking for. And first thing I want to talk about is good foliage color. A dark green or medium green is a signifier of a healthy plant. Try not to pick plants that are yellowing or have brown edges. Always try to stick with plants that have that darker green or the medium green. And sometimes that green varies based on what variety you're picking. And that's why I say it can be a medium. So basically avoid anything that's not green. Another thing is you want to make sure that the plants are nice and filled out and a good size for that variety and that for that size of pot that it's in. You know, a lot of times these trays are crowded together. And so when you're going and picking plants, they look like they're really nice and full until you pull that plant away from the other pots. And so that's one thing I encourage you to do when you're looking and browsing. Shuffle those plants around and take a look at how big they truly are, because a lot of times they're a lot smaller than what they look like. You want one with good branching, good size, lots of growth tips. Once again, no browning, no yellowing, but a good size for that pot, because plants are expensive. So I want you to be able to get your money's worth. Make sure they're compact and bushy. You know, not everything's like a tomato plant I put on the left. You know, the bigger the tomato plant, just you can sink it. So all that stem can become a lot of roots. Not all plants are like that. So we have to really be prepared to look around, look for plants that, once again, fill their pot, have nice, compact, bushy growth. You don't want anything long and lanky. You don't want stems that are bent. You don't want long internodes. So that's the distance between the two nodes. And you want a lot of good growing tips, especially when you're dealing with herbs or annuals and even perennials. You want to buy something, you know, worth the money that you're paying for. And this is one of my favorite things to do is pull the plants out of their pots. The roots of the plant should be white, and they can be off-white, but we try to avoid brown roots or black roots. And you want quite a few roots. And, you know, if it's got one or two roots and you can tell that it was just transplanted, that's one thing. But if you can tell it's been in that pot a while and you pull it out and there's very little roots at the edge of the pot, then you might go, well, I don't know if I really want that plant. And I will say, if the nursery person says something to you, or the person that's working that department at the store, just tell them you're looking for a healthy plant. Most time they'll say, okay. Just make sure to put the plant nicely, firm it back into the pot, and put it back on the shelf if you don't want it. I always tell people, if it's white roots, put them in your cart. If they're black or brown roots, put them back, because they're just not worth even trying to nurse back to health. Once those root rot pathogens set into that root system, that plant's just going to continue to decline, and odds are you're not going to be able to pull it out of it. So once again, pull the plant out of the pot and take a look at those roots, because it does make a difference. Also, I always try to encourage people to avoid plants with blooms. Go ahead, look at the tray. If that bloom is what you want, the color that you want, then seek out the same plant in that tray without blooms. Plants will establish a lot quicker if they have no blooms. If you can't help but buy a plant with blooms, pinch that bloom off right prior to planting. That way that plant has the message of, I want you to establish that root system, so that they will have a better root system quicker. If a plant is blooming and you sink it in the ground, you know, the message to that plant is bloom, 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 and it tends not to put as much of an emphasis on that root system. So definitely try to pick plants without blooms. And don't forget, if you're buying plants from a greenhouse or a shaded area at a retailer, make sure that you harden off your plants before you stick them out in full blazing sun. And a lot of that has to do with those plants have been protected from the wind and a lot of the sun rays by being in a greenhouse or a shade structure. And you will want to take that plant and gradually acclimate it to full sun, full wind, harsher environment type conditions. And so just keep that in mind. Acclimation might take a few days. It may take up to 7 days, just depending on the weather that we're having. You want to put them in a protected spot outdoors. and gradually expose them to light conditions and more windy type conditions over about 1 week. So it can take up to 7 to 10 days to do this. And then the other question we're having a lot of is that our soils are wet or they're really moist in some areas. And so the question is, do we still need to water in our plants if the soil is already wet? Well, the answer to that is yes. Regardless of that soil moisture, you want to make sure that plant is watered in very well after planting. And this does a few things. One is it settles that soil back into place, and it also settles those roots so that those roots can start establishing in that existing soil. It helps that soil to have a good contact with the roots. And once again, it encourages and speeds up that establishment. And when you water, I know a lot of people will just take a little cup and they'll water gently over the roots. Well, gently is great, but you need to water thoroughly. A little cup isn't going to do it. Make sure that you're watering thoroughly to get the whole root depth of that plant. So a lot of times if we're just doing a little water can or a little cup at a time, it's not wetting the root ball thoroughly. And the one thing I did miss on making a point of, when you're doing the transplanting, make sure that that root ball is moist, because if it's too dry, if you plant it, it's not going to become wet. So it needs to have some moisture in it before it gets planted, and then you add moisture once it is planted.